The Donald Trump administration is waging war on Venezuela, but this is part of a larger political war on Latin America. In the past few months, the U.S. government has imposed sanctions on the democratically elected president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. Trump has also imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil. This is one of the highest tariff rates on earth, and Trump has been very clear that he's directly meddling in Brazil's internal politics. Moreover, Trump has repeatedly claimed that he's going to take over the Panama Canal and colonize this important geostrategic territory in blatant violation of the sovereignty of Panama. And Trump has been openly interfering in elections in Latin America. For instance, the Trump administration offered $40 billion in a bailout to try to save Argentina's right-wing libertarian president, Javier Milei, who's a close Trump ally.
And I'm doing something that I don't often do. I'm giving a full endorsement to him. We just endorsed him for president. As you know, he has a race coming up, and I'm sure he's going to do well. But now I think this hopefully assures it. And to the people of Argentina, we're backing him 100%.
So today I'm going to be explaining why Donald Trump is so aggressive in Latin America and what the real goals of the U.S. empire are. Because what we're talking about is blatant imperialism or even neocolonialism. The U.S. empire is trying to impose its hegemony in the entire Western Hemisphere and especially in Latin America. And Trump is very clear that he wants to steal the natural resources of countries in the region so U.S. corporations can exploit those resources and make lots and lots of money.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
And in these flagrant attacks on the sovereignty of Latin America, Trump has three main goals. One, he wants to exploit the natural resources of the region, including oil and natural gas and gold and other minerals and agriculture and water. With climate change, water is going to become more and more important. So Trump wants U.S. corporations to take over those natural resources so his billionaire friends can profit. That's the first goal. Number two is the Trump administration wants to prevent all governments in the region from having close ties with China and also Russia and Iran, but especially China. China has become the number one trading partner of South America, so Trump is desperate to cut off China in this new Cold War that the U.S. is waging. And then finally, the third goal, which is related to the first two, of course, is to remove all left-wing governments in the region. And right now, it just so happens that the majority of the governments in the region are led by left-wing leaders. And Trump wants to have more right-wing leaders in the region who will obediently serve U.S. interests, like Javier Milei in Argentina, like Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. And it's not a coincidence that these are the closest U.S. allies in the region. And just like in the first Cold War, Latin America was dominated by right-wing dictatorships. The vast majority of countries were not democracies. They were U.S.-backed puppet dictatorships. And essentially, this is what the U.S. empire wants to go back to today. These are the imperial goals of Trump's neocolonial war on Latin America. And certainly this did not start with Trump. This goes back hundreds of years, but Trump has taken it to a whole new level. So today I'm going to be talking about the Trump administration's war on Latin America. And speaking of natural resources, let's talk about the U.S. war on Venezuela. Now, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and the Financial Times published an article based on interviews with top U.S. officials, and they admitted that the goal of the U.S. war on Venezuela is regime change. They want to overthrow Venezuela's independent left-wing government and install a right-wing U.S. puppet regime. Now, Trump claims that supposedly he's attacking Venezuela to stop the flow of drugs into the U.S. using war on drugs rhetoric. That's completely false. That's just the cynical excuse that the U.S. government is using to wage these wars of aggression in Latin America. The Financial Times admitted, quote, the priority now is to force the departure of top Venezuelan government officials, end quote. And they made it clear that the Trump administration is making plans to potentially kill Venezuela's constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro. The Financial Times noted that there is the, quote, clear threat that if Maduro and his inner circle cling to power, the Americans may use targeted military force to capture or kill them, end quote. So this is blatant neocolonialism like we saw in the 19th century. And the U.S. empire has two main goals other than overthrowing the Venezuelan government. First, the U.S. wants to exploit Venezuela's plentiful natural resources. And second, the U.S. wants to prevent China, Russia, and Iran from having allies in Latin America. I'm reading here from the Financial Times, quote, at stake in Venezuela are the world's largest proven oil reserves and valuable deposits of gold, diamonds, and coltan. A U.S. ally in the last century, the South American nation moved into the orbit of Russia, China, and Iran under Hugo Chavez, the ex-army officer who led a Bolivarian socialist revolution from 1999, end quote. The FT, of course, did not mention that Chavez was democratically elected, like his successor, Nicolás Maduro. And the U.S. government has a long history of carrying out coups in Latin America to overthrow democratically elected leaders. And we see that happening once again today in Venezuela. The Financial Times also quoted an anonymous American businessman with interests in Venezuela, and he has been communicating with Trump, and he told the FT, quote, what Trump wants in Venezuela is oil, minerals, and gold. He wants U.S. companies down there investing, end quote. So once again, this is a blatant colonial resource grab. The Financial Times quoted a very wealthy right-wing Venezuelan opposition figure who's very close to the Trump administration, and she admitted that, quote, the plan now is a capture of Nicolás Maduro, capture, kill, or capture, arrest, and take him out one way or another, end quote. So the strategy is for the U.S. empire to do either what it did to Panama in 1989, in which the U.S. invaded Panama and overthrew its government and arrested its leader. Or the other option is the U.S. war against Libya in 2011, in which the U.S. killed Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, and collapsed the state. And still today, 14 years later, Libya is a failed state that has been in a constant state of civil war. And to oversee the U.S. war on Venezuela, it's not only Donald Trump, but it's Marco Rubio who is leading the charge, according to the Financial Times. Marco Rubio is simultaneously serving as both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. And Rubio is a lifelong neoconservative war hawk from Florida, and his entire political career has been dedicated to trying to overthrow the socialist governments in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. This is his personal lifelong obsession. And back during Trump's first presidential term, in 2019, Trump launched another coup attempt in Venezuela. This failed, but during that previous coup attempt, in which the U.S. appointed the little-known right-wing opposition politician Juan Guaido as the fake so-called interim president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he never participated in a presidential election. Well, during that coup attempt, Marco Rubio had been lobbying the Trump administration to launch a military invasion of Venezuela to kill President Maduro. And now, of course, Rubio is the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Trump in his second term. And Rubio is carrying out what he's been calling for years, which is a military war on Venezuela to overthrow Venezuela's constitutional, internationally recognized government and install a puppet regime. And in fact, some of Trump's close political allies are proud of the fact that this is a colonial war. On Fox News, the neoconservative Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a close Trump ally, and the Fox News host Sean Hannity, and Trump is a huge fan of Sean Hannity and often watches his show and talks about how much he likes Hannity. Well, in a Fox News segment, they floated the idea that the U.S. government should colonize Venezuela and turn it into the 51st state. So again, I repeat, This is 19th century style colonialism.
I had a chat with you this weekend, and I thought you had a pretty darn good idea, and you said you were going to share it with the president. I want to know if you did, and that is this opposition leader in Venezuela that won the Nobel Prize that said it really deserved to go to Donald Trump. Sounds like a pretty good leader to me for the people of Venezuela, and the end of narco-terrorism and a better relationship with the U.S. Or if they choose maybe the 51st state, I don't know.
Sounds good to me.
Now, as part of this colonial war in Venezuela, the Trump administration has carried out numerous attacks, not only in the Caribbean, but also now in the Pacific. The U.S. military has bombed numerous boats and killed dozens of people without trial, including not only Venezuelans, but also Colombians and poor fishermen from Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Tobago. There is no evidence whatsoever that these were drug traffickers. That is the claim that the Trump administration is making without any evidence whatsoever. That is the excuse they're using to justify waging this colonial war in Latin America. And one of the few leaders in the region who has been bravely speaking out against the U.S. war is Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro. He has warned that the U.S. government is threatening to drag the entire region into a larger conflict and set Latin America on fire. And in response, the Trump administration has expanded its war that started on Venezuela, and now the Trump administration is also targeting Colombia, and the U.S. Treasury has imposed sanctions on the democratically elected sitting president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. This is a blatant violation of the sovereignty of Colombia and its elected government. And this came after an angry post that Trump posted on his Twitter copy website, Truth Social, in which he attacked Colombia's president and he repeatedly misspelled the name of the country. It's Colombia with an O, but Trump repeatedly wrote Columbia with a U, like the university in New York City. And while misspelling the name of the country, Trump falsely claimed without any evidence that supposedly Petro is a, quote, illegal drug leader, end quote. This is completely false, and this is a blatant attack, once again, on the democratically elected sitting president of a foreign country. This is blatant imperialism. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's a billionaire hedge fund manager from Wall Street, he falsely claimed, this is completely false. He said, since President Gustavo Petro came to power, cocaine production in Colombia has exploded to record high rates. That is a blatant lie. Independent experts have in fact shown that cocaine production has fallen under President Petro, and he pointed out on Twitter that what the U.S. Treasury is saying is a lie. Coca leaf cultivation under his government has been falling. He reduced rates from 13% in 2022 to 9% in 2023 to 3% in 2024. And he noted that, on the contrary, his government has seized more cocaine than in the entire history of the world. In fact, cocaine production grew very significantly in Colombia under the previous right-wing president, Iván Duque, who was a close U.S. ally and a personal friend of Donald Trump. And in fact, during Trump's first term, Iván Duque's government in Colombia played a key role in the coup attempt in neighboring Venezuela. Juan Guaidó, the U.S.-backed coup leader, was working in Colombia, carrying out operations to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And in May 2020, there was a botched invasion of Venezuela carried out by mercenaries who were trained by U.S. Army Special Operations Forces in northern Colombia, and they traveled from Colombia into Venezuela as part of this U.S.-backed failed invasion to try to overthrow the government of Nicolás Maduro. In fact, if you know anything about the recent history of politics in Colombia, you would know that the worst drug dealers in the country have always been the closest U.S. allies, including, for instance, the right-wing former president Álvaro Uribe, one of the closest U.S. allies in all of Latin America. U.S. intelligence agencies have known for decades that he is a drug trafficker who is a close personal friend of Pablo Escobar and worked closely with the notorious Medellin cartel. But because Uribe is a right-wing multimillionaire oligarch who's extremely anti-communist and very anti-Cuba, anti-Venezuela, and anti-Nicaragua, this drug leader has been one of the closest, most obedient U.S. allies in Latin America. And in fact, at the same time that the Trump administration is waging war on Venezuela and now a political war on Colombia based on false claims that it's a war on drugs, meanwhile, Marco Rubio has been openly praising Álvaro Uribe, one of the worst drug traffickers in the history of Latin America. And on the 21st of October, Rubio published a tweet praising Uribe and thanking the Colombian judicial system for not imprisoning this corrupt drug trafficking criminal. And then back in July, when the Trump administration started this new coup attempt in Venezuela in this war, Rubio published another tweet praising this drug trafficking criminal, Uribe, and he claimed that, quote, former Colombian President Uribe's only crime has been to tirelessly fight and defend his homeland, end quote. This is completely absurd. The U.S. government has known for decades, according to declassified U.S. cables, that Uribe is a drug lord who works closely with cartels. And we've also known for decades that Uribe has worked closely with right-wing death squads in Colombia who have killed left-wing leaders and labor leaders and land defenders and indigenous leaders on behalf of large corporations who want to get access to land and resources in Colombia, and they want to kick the poor and indigenous people living off that land, and they use violence, and they use death squads and paramilitary groups which have been closely linked to Uribe and his criminal gang, which again are the closest U.S. allies in Latin America. And in fact, one of the family ranches of Uribe was used as a base for a death squad. We've known this all for decades. He's one of the worst criminals in Latin America. So this war that Donald Trump is waging on Latin America has nothing to do with drugs. The so-called war on drugs was always a cynical excuse used by the U.S. empire to justify interfering in the internal affairs of foreign countries, and we see the same thing happening again today. And I have to add an interesting little note here, which is that apparently President Gustavo Petro of Colombia agrees with me, because this is something that I tweeted. I said the blatant attack on Colombia's sovereignty has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with imperialism. And Gustavo Petro followed me on Twitter and he retweeted this tweet, which apparently means that he agrees at least partially with this analysis that I'm making today, which is that the Trump administration is using the so-called war on drugs as a cynical excuse in order to wage a neocolonial war on Latin America to try to reimpose hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And the U.S. empire sees Gustavo Petro as a threat to U.S. dominance in the region because historically, Colombia was the single most important U.S. ally in Latin America. And under Gustavo Petro, who's the first ever left-wing president of Colombia, the country has been pursuing a more independent foreign policy. And in fact, under the leadership of Gustavo Petro, Colombia has now boosted its ties with China and has joined China's global infrastructure project, the Bolton Road Initiative. This has terrified the U.S. empire, and hawkish U.S. think tanks are warning that China's influence in Latin America is growing, and this is one of the main reasons why the Trump administration is being so aggressive in Latin America, trying to recolonize the region. And essentially what the Trump administration is telling the region is that it cannot have close relations with China and also Russia and Iran. Now, during the first Cold War, China did not really have relations with most countries in Latin America. However, in the past 20 years, China's economic relations with Latin America have grown significantly. And in fact, today, China is now the #1 trading partner of South America and Central America. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. One is, of course, Mexico, which is the southern neighbor of the U.S., and over 80% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S. They have a free trade agreement, so Mexico is kind of an outlier. But if you exclude Mexico, Latin America's largest trading partner is China, If you look at South America, China is already the number one trading partner of Brazil, Venezuela, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia. But Colombia still does more trade with the US because historically, Colombia was dominated by these right-wing oligarchs who were very corrupt and linked to drug trafficking, but they made sure that everything in the Colombian economy revolved around exporting to the US and buying imports from the US. Well, that situation has been changing, and it's likely that if Colombia goes in a more independent direction, in a few years, China will be the number one trading partner of Colombia as well, which is another reason why the Trump administration is being so aggressive against Colombia, because the US wants to meddle in Colombia's internal affairs, because an election in Colombia is coming up in May of 2026, in just several months, and the Trump administration is desperate to put back in power a right-wing, multimillionaire, oligarchic puppet who will serve U.S. interests at the expense of the Colombian people, and of course the interests of U.S. corporations who want to exploit the resources of the countries in the region. Like Venezuela, Colombia has a lot of natural resources, and it's a major producer of oil. So Trump is blatantly meddling in Colombia's internal affairs as its election comes up in several months, and he's sending a message to not only politicians in Colombia, but across Latin America, that if you don't obediently do what the U.S. empire wants, the U.S. will impose sanctions on you, try to carry out a regime change operation, or even militarily attack you and threaten to kill you, like what Trump is doing to Venezuela right now. And what all of this shows is how the Trump administration is bringing back a colonial doctrine that is more than 200 years old. We're talking about the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared in 1823, in which the U.S. empire, which was just starting to expand at the time, essentially declared that all of Latin America was its imperial backyard, in scare quotes. And the Wall Street Journal published a very interesting article based on interviews with top U.S. government officials who are referring to this as the Donroe Doctrine. This is how the Wall Street Journal described this colonial Donroe Doctrine, treating the Western Hemisphere, quote, as an extension of the U.S. homeland where Washington will act unilaterally to root out perceived enemies. Loyalty is rewarded and defiance can carry a price, end quote. And this is exactly what we've seen. Argentina's right-wing libertarian president Javier Milei is an obedient U.S. puppet, and the Trump administration is giving him $40 billion to try to save him to meddle in Argentina's elections. But then independent leaders who stand up to the U.S. empire and who defend their country's sovereignty face severe punishment. So the U.S. is trying to kill the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, and the U.S. just imposed sanctions on Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro. So this is what U.S. government officials refer to as the Donroe Doctrine. And the Wall Street Journal noted that U.S. Southern Command, which is the part of the U.S. military that oversees operations in Latin America, Southern Command, or Southcom, has found itself on the front line with more resources and a vastly expanded mission. And this report noted that half of the countries visited so far by Secretary of State Marco Rubio have been in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in fact, the first trip that Marco Rubio took abroad as Secretary of State was to Panama, where he threatened Panama. He visited the Panama Canal and said that the U.S. wants to take it over. And the Trump administration forced Panama to withdraw from China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which they're now trying to force other countries in Latin America to leave as well. And so-called defense secretary, although he actually renamed himself the war secretary, Pete Hegseth, has rebranded Trump's slogan of America First and made it the Americas First. So their goal is to impose control over all of the Americas, from Canada in North America, which Trump jokes about making the 51st U.S. state, down to the southern tip of South America in Argentina. And the Wall Street Journal interviewed Steve Bannon, a close Trump ally who was actually the CEO of Trump's previous presidential campaign. And then in 2017, Bannon served as Trump's top advisor. And Bannon referred to this proudly as Monroe 2.0. So this is just neocolonialism, colonialism 2.0. And Bannon argued that it's actually easier to sell this war in Latin America to the so-called America First base, these MAGA Republicans, rather than the non-stop U.S. wars in the Middle East, in West Asia. So what Bannon is admitting is that the MAGA Republicans are not anti-war. They're not anti-interventionist. They are completely pro-imperialist and colonialist. They simply want to change the target. And instead of war on Russia, they want war on Latin America. And the Wall Street Journal pointed out this is not new. During Trump's first term as president, top U.S. officials invoked the colonial Monroe Doctrine in order to justify coup attempts in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. This included Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, a neoconservative war hawk who was one of the architects of the Iraq War in the George W. Bush administration, and also Trump's CIA director turned Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Both of those neocons invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the coup attempt that Trump carried out during his first term against Venezuela. And in fact, John Bolton boasted on CNN that it was a coup attempt.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable. But I think there's another...
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though.
I'm sure there is.
So the Wall Street Journal has described Trump's war on Latin America as his new war on terror, in scare quotes. And just like the first so-called war on terror, this is also a cynical imperial war based on lies. It's not actually about terror. Like the war on drugs was not actually about drugs. This is about imperialism. And the Wall Street Journal pointed out that Trump has also been rewarding obedient U.S. puppets in Latin America, like, for instance, El Salvador's right-wing leader, Nayib Bukele, and Argentina's U.S. puppet leader, Javier Milei. And I was surprised to see that the Wall Street Journal even quoted part of the speech that was given by Bolivia's left-wing president, Luis Arce, at the United Nations General Assembly this year, 2025, in which he warned of the return of Monroeism that, quote, asserts that the Americas belong to the North Americans, creating conditions for a new moment of neocolonialism, end quote. That was the warning made by Bolivia's president, Luis Arce. And of course, in 2019, the first Trump administration backed a violent coup in Bolivia that overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales. And on the subject of the U.S. attacks on Latin America, I have to say the Financial Times published another article that was quite good, that described how Trump is bringing back colonial gunboat diplomacy in his attacks on not only Venezuela, but other countries in the region. This article pointed out that the CIA has carried out coups in Latin America against democratically elected left-wing leaders like Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, in 1954, and there are dozens of other examples. And this FT article acknowledged that the CIA tried to assassinate Cuba's revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, and according to declassified U.S. government documents, the U.S. empire tried to kill Castro 638 times, which is the most assassination attempts against a single person in the history of the world, at least for which we have documents. So this is the reign of terror that the U.S. empire has carried out in Latin America. And the Financial Times cited research done by a historian at Columbia University in New York who found that between 1898 and 1994, the U.S. constantly intervened in Latin America and overthrew at least 41 governments in 100 years. And since 1994, the U.S. interventions in Latin America have only increased. In fact, according to data published by the U.S. government, the U.S. military has intervened in every single country in Latin America except French Guiana, which is a French colony located in the northern part of South America. But the U.S. military has been engaged nonstop in this region for centuries, and the U.S. military has invaded many countries, including within recent memory, Panama and Grenada, and basically Nicaragua. The CIA carried out a terror war on Nicaragua in the 1980s, like the terror war we see being carried out against Venezuela today. The Financial Times also importantly pointed out that in the 1840s, U.S. colonialists invaded Mexico in a war of aggression, and the U.S. empire stole half of Mexico's territory. They colonized the northern half of Mexico, including the present-day U.S. states of California, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico. That's why it's called New Mexico, because it was part of Old Mexico until the U.S. colonial war of aggression against Mexico from 1846 to 1848. The Financial Times also admitted that the U.S. military occupied numerous countries in Central America and the Caribbean during the so-called Banana Wars, in which the U.S. government was acting on behalf of U.S. corporations like the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita, or Standard Fruit, now known as Dole. So there's a long history of blatant U.S. imperialism in Latin America. And Trump's war in Venezuela directly mirrors that colonial history. The Financial Times pointed out that the Trump administration has three main goals in this colonial war in Venezuela. Those are the goals I talked about earlier. I think this is correct analysis. One, Trump wants to overthrow Maduro's independent left-wing government. Two, Trump wants U.S. companies to take over Venezuela's oil and other natural resources. And three, Trump wants to kick out China and Russia from Latin America and prevent countries in the region from having their own independent foreign policy and having their own consensual relations with China and Russia. As the Financial Times put it, quote, Trump has made no secret of his desire to push Beijing out of a region he sees as a sphere of U.S. influence, end quote. And this article pointed out that it's not a coincidence that Trump's biggest role model was the ardent imperialist William McKinley. And as president of the U.S. at the end of the 19th century, McKinley vastly expanded the U.S. empire. He colonized Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba, and he set the stage for building the Panama Canal, which was previously U.S. colonial territory in Panama. And Trump is proud of the fact that he admires McKinley and wants to recreate McKinley's colonial policies in Latin America. And the day that Trump entered office for his second term as president, he signed an executive order titled Restoring Names That Honor American Greatness. And the first name that Trump mentioned in this executive order was the colonialist William McKinley. And he praised him not only for imposing tariffs, Trump is imposing tariffs in countries all around the world, but also Trump praised McKinley because he oversaw a, quote, expansion of territorial gains for the nation, end quote. And this is something that Trump has repeatedly promised. He told his supporters that he's going to physically expand the territory of the U.S. empire, and in particular, he wants to colonize parts of Latin America.
The United States has the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we may be a very substantially enlarged country in the not too distant. Isn't it nice to see, for years, for decades, we're the same size to the square foot, probably got smaller, actually, but we might be an enlarged country pretty soon. And one of the things we're going to be doing is drill, baby, drill. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars.
So Trump is proud of the fact that he's a colonialist. Now, all U.S. presidents are war criminals and imperialists. This is not new. This is true for both Republicans and Democrats. But as I often repeat, the difference with Trump is he doesn't hide it. He doesn't use this propaganda rhetoric about democracy and human rights. He says the quiet part loud. Trump has taken the mask off of the U.S. empire and shown its true ugly face, which is one based on war, exploitation, and imperialism. This is why he renamed the so-called Department of Defense the Department of War. He's proud of the fact that he's a warmongering imperialist. So again, to conclude, if you want to understand what Trump is actually doing in Latin America, it has nothing to do with drugs. The U.S. has historically been closely allied with the worst drug dealers in Latin America. In reality, this is about imposing the hegemony of the U.S. empire in Latin America, turning all of the Western Hemisphere into an imperial so-called sphere of influence, bringing back the colonial Monroe Doctrine, overthrowing independent left-wing leaders in the region, and putting obedient right-wing oligarchic puppets in power who will allow U.S. corporations to exploit the natural resources and labor of the region. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.